Good afternoon. My name is Jaime Correa, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture of the University of Miami, where I'm also the coordinator of the Master in Urban Design. Additionally, I'm a founding partner of a small urban design firm called Jaime Correa and Associates. I really appreciate your attendance to this presentation and must express my sincere admiration for the endurance and for your desire to acquire knowledge. Typically, these congresses wear you out, and by Saturday afternoon at this time, you barely want to spend time in a dark room in an awful convention center. This session will deal with 4 of the most provocative topics in the current history of the New World. And those are security, modern traditions in architecture and planning, urban informalities, and space syntax, classification, and data mapping. Unlike what you may expect, these 4 topics will be approached from the point of view of practice. In fact, all of the presenters here, in one way or another, are involved in the production of projects and in the advancement of their own disciplines through pragmatic means. On one hand, we have Seth Harry, a retail designer expert, who is an extraordinary urban designer, talking not only about behavior, marketing, or consumption, because most probably you've heard these things in other sessions already, but about issues of urban protection and security. Then we have Jean-Francois Lejeune, who is the director of the graduate program at the University of Miami and the School of Architecture of the University of Miami, and one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. He will take us in the mind of Le Corbusier and various other aspects of modernity. This is a unique presentation, tremendous presentation that is, a result of his investigations in Latin America. You know that he's the author of some of the most important books on the history of modern and colonial Latin America. Cruelty and Utopia is the name of his most recent book on this subject. Adib Kure is an assistant professor at the University of Miami and a founding partner of Kure Penavad Architects and Town Planners. And he's the recipient of one CNU award for his spectacular plaza in the design district, and he will introduce us to his studies and interventions in informal areas of a city in Colombia called Barranquilla. Finally, Claudia Ortiz, the director of the Master in Architecture and New Urbanism at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey in Querétaro, Mexico. She's a disciple of Bill Hillier at Bartlett University, where she's getting her PhD right now. And she will take us into the dungeons of classification and mapping through space syntax in Mexico City. That's the subject of her research for her doctoral dissertation right now. Without any more delays, please let us welcome Seth, Jean-Francois, Adib, and Claudia. Thank you. Seth, you're on.
Perfect. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Jaime forgot to mention when he was referring to this awful convention center that there's also a spectacular beach about 5 minutes from here, so you guys really are dedicated. We've been working in Guatemala for about the last 15 years designing market rate homes for sort of real Guatemalans. And based on the principles of New Urbanism, the biggest challenge that we always encounter is the issue of security. And so we've talked, this presentation is intended to talk a little bit about some of the strategies and techniques that we've used to address those issues and to allow us to continue to move forward with sort of reestablishing traditional models of urbanism in Central and Latin America. So the title is Security by Design Using Traditional Urban Strategies to Address Issues of Physical Security. There's been a focus in this year's CNU on resilient and sustainable communities, and of course we've been talking about that for some time in the new urbanism, and it typically focuses on things like food security, energy security, and economic resiliency. And when these subjects are usually talked about, the implication is we're going to be living in a resource scarce future, and the graphic examples of how that might shape our urban form moving forward is usually illustrated along the lines of the classic sort of English village, idyllic English village in the countryside. The reality though, is in countries where there's also significant income disparity, all of those factors add up to another type of insecurity, and that is physical insecurity. And so this model is probably not ideally suited for those applications. Here in the U.S., where those issues are starting to resonate in the marketplace, they've manifested themselves primarily in suburban locations in the form of gated communities, which, by the way, South Florida has some of the finest examples of entry features you'll find anywhere. And the idea is to kind of give an implied or implicit sense of security if you can afford to be inside the wall. Of course, if you can't afford to be inside the wall, your options are somewhat more limited to the classic, window guards and neighborhood watch programs. If you can't afford to be inside the wall, you have a different challenge in suburban context, because typically these gated communities have no commercial or civic amenities within them. So there's a trade-off there. And then, of course, if you live in Latin America, the issue of security has been one of much more immediate relevance than what is generally perceived in the U.S., where gated communities are still considered somewhat of a luxury item, whereas in many parts of Central and Latin America, it's an absolute necessity. And of course, the form in which that takes place, these security techniques and strategies, are not always either most visually compelling, but they're also not consistent, again, with our principles of traditional urbanism. Ironically, the solution has sort of kind of been in front of us all along. The law of the Indies, which is often interpreted as an urban design technique, a set of rules and principles, has at its heart, I think, a very practical set of considerations about security. And, of course, the fact that it creates incredibly compelling and beautiful places is almost sometimes seems incidental. But this is Antigua de Guatemala, the ancient colonial capital in Guatemala, very close to many of the places that we've worked. And you can see that certainly the security here is not overtly obvious in the public plaza, and it hasn't diminished the aesthetic qualities of the place in the least. So we've tried to take some of those principles and adapt them into contemporary projects in Guatemala, mixed-use projects, where we recognize and understand the market imperative of being able to talk realistically and pragmatically about the issue of security, and still have projects that embody the principles of openness and interaction that we hold so dear. So in looking at the classic strategies of traditional strategies of dealing with security based on the law of the Indies, you have sort of a multi-level or multi-tiered approach. The first level and the most fundamental is the house as a secure compound. And then typically we set that within what we call a perimeter block, which is also secure. So you have sort of the addition of being part of a larger secure assemblage. And then the third level is what is typically referred to in Guatemala as the condominium, which is a secure neighborhood. And this is somewhat analogous to the secure or gated communities in the U.S., and that there's typically no commercial activity within that compound. The good news is the condominium is typically sized, it's about 1/4 of the size of a classic 5-minute walk neighborhood. So you can actually still do a community comprised almost exclusively of condominiums and still have a fair level of connectivity and permeability. And then the final piece is the town center, which we promote as a comprehensively managed but publicly accessible mixed-use district where different classes can intermingle. And mind you, any commercial project in Guatemala is going to be heavily managed in terms of access, in terms of security, in terms of all of those things. So the question isn't really whether or not this is feasible, but whether or not it can be done in an urban form and in relation to a larger urban assemblage. And this is the project that the town center of that project I just illustrated. And it's interesting to note also that almost all the projects we do in Guatemala are market rate projects. So in other words, these are not resort second home communities for affluent Americans or internationals, but places where the locals can live and work and interact. One of the first projects we did in Guatemala, what brought me to Guatemala originally, is El Naranjo, which actually Jaime brought me down for, and this is the master plan for this on the left. And what you can see here, I'm just illustrating diagrammatically how what looks like a wonderful new urbanist plan can actually be comprised of individual discrete subcomponents. In this particular case, these are all individually gated condominiums. And you can see they take the form of a traditional larger urban place, and the hope and the expectation is that at some point in the future, should the security situation in Guatemala be better resolved, that we can open up those walls, open up those gates, and make these condominiums part of a larger community structure. The red there indicates the town center, and then we have in blue two sort of more dedicated focused districts. One's an industrial park, and then the other one is sort of an office campus or downtown, and something that we proposed, which was a more conventional North American type model of retail center. The plan in the upper right is a detailed architectural plan for the proposed town center. That's the detail in the red. And then in the lower right is as a three-dimensional model. We often will do architectural charrettes. We bring architects in and sort of divide up the town center into individual pieces. I'll show you an example of this a little later on that you probably saw yesterday that Leon Creer presented. But the idea is that you come through the town center or the village center into the individual neighborhoods, and so even regardless of the mix of classes within the community, there's an opportunity for everybody to intermingle effectively as a group and as a community. And this is a current Google Earth image of that same project. So you can see it now in three-dimensional. These are all, each of these are actual, these condominiums, and then this is the site for the town center here, which you saw the design for in the previous slide. And we've actually already brought in a grocery store, a Pice, which has subsequently been bought out by Walmart. But the point is we're building this project out incrementally on the basis and principles of new urbanism, and then you'll also notice that there's this sort of green corridor through the middle. That's a subsequent phase. These are higher density, secure building types, kind of more or less analogous to a dooryard apartment building, a doorman apartment building in Mexico. Thank you. And what's interesting is in Guatemala, multifamily is actually more typically associated with the upper classes. This is an affordable middle class community, so we haven't yet. The developer has been focusing almost exclusively on the single family units, but we think as the project builds out, the demand for those product types will increase also. In El Salvador, Jaime and I again worked with our local colleague Juan Pablo Rosales, who I should have mentioned on the other slide, and Eddie Castillo, who's another Guatemalan architect and urban designer, and we took the same idea and applied it to infill site in El Salvador. And in this particular case, what we did, we captured an existing roadway that came through the site, actually followed that trajectory, and we brought it through the site and built both sides. So our town center in this particular case is right here. The security isn't quite as challenging in El Salvador, so we didn't get to the level of the condominiums, but the individual blocks are secure. So this is sort of a level 2, if you will, security, but the town center is still an open place. And then in this particular case, because of that, we could actually bring these sort of secondary roads through the town center to drive traffic into the town center to energize the commercial there. This is a project that we worked on, I think, late last year. This is Antigua, Guatemala right here, the project you saw at the beginning of the presentation. And this is a large coffee plantation that we're designing an urban extension to Antigua for. And here's one where we sort of used sort of gradations of security. This initial phase here is completely open. The blocks are secure. This is the commercial precincts. And then as you move further into the site, we increase the levels of security, and then at some point we get into the secure condominiums. This is a charrette model we built in the original charrette. And I won't tell you how little time we did this in. It's almost embarrassing. But these actually are existing street networks that we attach into, again, to drive energy into the site. And this is a conceptual merchandising plan that we developed during the charrette process to show how, even though these look like and cue from very traditional models of urban form, that they are merchandised just like conventional American retail projects. And so we're sort of, again, trying to use these traditional models to allow us to build contemporary, successful, practical, commercial mixed-use centers that are successful in the marketplace and embody all of those principles. This is the town center of one of our projects that we did with Jaime and Juan Pablo and Leon Creer. Leon Creer came in and did the master plan for the entire project as well as the town center. But this embodies all of the principles that we've been talking about, all of these techniques and strategies. This was just prior to opening on my last trip to Guatemala. The project has been very, very successful, and I think will help to change a lot of the attitudes and skepticism, if you will, about the practicality of this approach. And I'm closing with this image. This is a sketch I did for a town center that we're designing for, again, a project that was originally master planned by Leon Creer. He did this shortly after we finished the other project in Guatemala, and I introduced him to one of my clients. This is in Northern California. And you can see that there's virtually no distinction between the quality of the physical environment and the viability of the commercial precinct based on these principles, whether it be in the U.S. or in Latin America. So this is sort of taking a very practical approach using the principles, the traditional principles of urban design in that region in order to, again, meet the principles of compact, walkable, mixed use, while taking into consideration the practical concerns of security. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. Leave it here. Good afternoon, everybody. This was very fast, much faster than usual. This is quite a difficult task, in fact, what Jaime proposed us to do, in a way, to do a brief history of the New World, which is a gigantic continent with an enormous history, and do that in about an hour, 15 minutes with 4 speakers is quite challenging. So, as Jaime mentioned, I thought that it would be interesting to use the Latin American territory in terms of how important some of the ideas of urban planning and modern urban planning have been on the continent, and how much some of those ideas are still valid today. So this is quite different, let's say, from perhaps a traditional new urbanist perspective. It deals more with a certain amount of moments, important moments of modernity in the 20th century, and also about the changes. We've talked a lot about the law of the Indies during this conference, but of course the law of the Indies revolved around a particular moment in history. And of course, things have changed a lot, and this is pretty much what I'm going to try to present, and I'll come back to this painting in a moment when we get there. Jaime mentioned my interest on Latin America, related, of course, to living in Miami, and very quickly discovering the importance of the law of the Indies, of the grid in Latin America. And I had the opportunity to further those research through a series of publications, but also a very important exhibition that I did in Brussels, and you can see there to the left the entrance of that exhibition, called Cruelty and Utopia, Cruelty and Utopia, and which was an exhibition which also had the sort of completely arrogant objective of presenting a sort of a history of modernity of Latin American architecture and planning within one exhibit, which nobody would ever dare doing in Europe or in the United States. But when it comes to Latin America, we always get a little more arrogant in trying to condense everything very quickly. And of course, references to the pre-Columbian past, reference to the popular culture, which is that Judas belonging to the collection of Diego Rivera, and the cover of the catalog in English with Brasilia and Roberto Burle Marx. Of course, I had to put my images of the law of the Indies, and here a foundation plans, and I thought it was interesting to also show that the law of the Indies, in fact, it's been talked a lot about. The law of the Indies had almost nothing to say and nothing to do with the foundation of Latin American cities. Most of them were actually founded before. The law of the Indies really had to do with the stabilization and the consolidation of Latin American cities, because real Latin American cities only started to generate real urban form in the late 17th, early 1800s. Years, so in the late 17th and early 18th century. Before that, Latin American cities, even on a grid, even drawn within these spectacular plans, which one is an original of 1563, were in fact extremely informal and pretty much built out of completely haphazard buildings simply lined along the street. But the process of consolidation, the fact that the plan was maintained and continuously rebuilt and reinforced, is really where the strength of the law of the Indies is. And you can see an example of that consolidation process in an image that always surprises me, the incredible density, the incredible power of the grid here in Mexico, in the city of Puebla. Also, the incredible relationship of Latin American cities with their landscape, and of course that is even more prevalent in Latin America than in the Caribbean, where the whole colonization started, as we know. And this image of Atitlan in the area of Lake Pátzcuaro always has been one of my favorite ones. This is an original hand drawing done in the 1570s of the power of that original idea of the grid with the central square drawn within the extraordinary landscape of the central of Mexico. Now, for many, many years, decades, and centuries, Latin American cities remain essentially very flat landscape, 1 or 2 floors average. It's a very, very low profile. And in the case, of course, of the grandest of all, Mexico City, here you can see this, this idea of a horizontal city in a way that is extremely rational and extremely powerful. The city of palaces, only punctuated by churches and spires. But modernity, of course, will arrive in Latin America through, at the end of the wars of independence, which takes place at various moments during the 19th century. Of course, they will, modernity in the 19th century will be driven to new means of transportation, new technologies. I find these paintings of one of the first trains running in the Valley of Mexico very, very beautiful. Only, again, this incredible landscape and the volcanoes. And, of course, the French influence, which after hundreds of years of domination by Spanish influences and Spanish conditions, will become, in fact, the southern element of modernity. So the modernity in Latin America in the 19th century comes with the introduction of French ideas, grand monuments, grand boulevards, and also the development of parks, paseos, and various interventions. The 19th century is the moment where the central square of Latin American cities, which was pretty much a barren space, essentially made out of soil, and with the fountain in the center, or even the place where people would be hung if they had committed a crime, will eventually be replaced by something more civilized, which is in fact the park with its fountains, monuments, and other structures to usually commemorate the history of independence and other leaders. Also, in this perspective, Grand Boulevard will be established. This is the Paseo de la Reforma, one of the grandest boulevards in Latin America, here in Mexico City, built essentially on the model of the Champs-Élysées, and certainly not missing in the same grandeur and same importance. I put here on the right one building, a very important modern structure of the early 1930s in Mexico City, which shows essentially the sort of radical change that takes place in the 20th century, pretty much at the beginning of the 20th century, in pretty much all Latin American cities, which is to pass from a horizontal city, hyper-horizontal city. In fact, half of the height that Leon Crier would like us to believe it's the necessary height, into something that will explode vertically. And you can see the beginnings of that very clearly here, influenced, of course, by some French development, but also by American developments, such as skyscrapers and so on. Sometimes paintings can be most telling about the changes and the transformation of urban territories. And this one, which represents a grand avenue in the center of Mexico, painted by Deer Atal, and which shows basically the introduction of modern traffic, the car within the historic center, and a shift in what the urban space means, and also the way urban space is defined, introduction, of course, of public lighting and so on. And also in the painting, I think this is one of my favorite paintings of the 20th century in Spain, right after the war, Mexico, sorry, right after the war by Frida Kahlo, an image of the Alameda, the central garden, the central park of Mexico City, of which you can see an aerial representation at the bottom to the left in the late 18th century. And you can see it's an allegory of civic life and public life, which is very important, and also shift gear, shift location from the sort of traditional space of the grid into other spaces such as parks and other locations. Coming back to the painting that you saw at the very beginning of the presentation, this one by Juan O'Gorman, simply called La Ciudad de Mexico, also painted at the end of, just at the end of the war, of the Second World War, which is one of the most important paintings, I think, done in the 20th century, an urban painting, because it really shows and talks about the transformation, that verticalization of Mexico City, but it could be Buenos Aires, it could be Santiago, it could be Guadalajara, it could be a lot of other cities, and it's beautifully depicted here, this sort of the beginning of the problems, as we can see, and certainly the appearance of modern language within the urban setting, the introduction, massive introduction of the car. But what is also quite beautiful here is these hands, which are basically the hands of the painter, Juan O'Gorman, who was one of the greatest architects of middle 20th century in Mexico. Actually, it is a reproduction of one of the original plans of Tenochtitlan, so Mexico City before the Spaniards, an enormous metropolis in its age, late 15th century. It's a plan that is actually conserved somewhere in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. So the painter sort of looks at that plan and at the same time shows the transformation of that very city, which has already gone through almost 500 years of demolition, destruction, reconstruction, transformation. And if you look around, you can see very interesting details. You have this sort of mestizo worker, sort of a mix of Indian blood and Spanish-Mexican blood, actually building a wall made out of concrete beams and brick, holding a blueprint in his hands, but at the same time you can see to the right of the painting, you can see, for example, a couple of stone blocks there, basaltic, sort of volcanic stone blocks, which are the sort of stone of which the region of Mexico is made, of which most of the pre-Columbian monuments were made, and which in fact Juan O'Gorman himself used in his own architecture. A very interesting allegory of transformation and change. Details here, you can see the plans, all the various buildings, and of course a painting like that you can read and you can write a lot about it. Other important elements for me and which are always somewhat neglected, even in the CNU, which is essentially university campuses, which in my opinion in the United States and also in Latin America are some of the most one of the greatest invention of the Americas is in fact the campus. Perhaps we could learn much more from the campus in terms of modern planning. And Latin Americans certainly are not behind in reinventing even further what the North American created. And here is one of the original images of the central campus of UNAM, Universidad Nacional in Mexico, which is fundamentally a reinterpretation by Mario Pani, Juan O'Gorman, and many others, a sort of a reinterpretation of something that always has to be behind and we always have to think about when we deal with Latin America, essentially the pre-Columbian past and the particular way of conceiving space that pre-Columbian civilization had developed in Tenochtitlan, in the Maya country, in Cusco, in Lima, and some of those areas, i.e. extremely large public spaces, in fact, the opposite of our traditional European vision about what public space, extremely large spaces that eventually embrace the landscape, embrace the sky, and all of that, of course, based on mythological and religious concept very, very strongly. And of course, the campus of the University of Mexico being marked architectonically with the O'Gorman's library and the history of the continent, the history of Mexico, colonial and pre-Columbian history in mosaic on both faces of the structure. But I also think it's important to think about an architect like Luis Barragan, one of the great modern architects of Latin America, who developed his architecture and his urbanism in part on relationship to colonial architecture, reinterpretation of colonial architecture, and here in his own house in Mexico City, which is the light pink house, which is a house of late 1940s, early 1950s, and it is completely undifferentiated from anything else around. It completely integrates itself within the urban fabric. It's not an isolated house like most of the icons of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and some others. It's actually a house which is fundamentally urban and totally integrated within the urbanism of the city, and which uses, of course, inside a series of references both to modernity and tradition, in construction material, in particular details about how those materials are put into place, but also in the extraordinary furnishings that actually mix modern and tradition in a way that is incomparable and that is very difficult to find within the same period in Europe, for instance. And in the upper roof of Barragan's house is this famous patio, open patio to the sky. It's actually a patio open to the sky, but not to the street, which is, of course, a reinterpretation of a structure that had developed for hundreds of years. Suburbanization and let's say American style suburbanization, of course, has impacted Latin America extremely strongly. And perhaps the best example, in a way, of something that, in fact, as we all know, is somewhat devil, is also by Barragan in the famous neighborhood of Pedregal, actually a neighborhood of volcanic stone. You can see the plan over there, which is a completely organic plan, abandoning the grid in a way as a sort of a information about security, right? And so it's a way of being secure by abandoning the grid and actually going towards something much more controlled and organic. And some of those absolutely beautiful moments of that suburban neighborhood, which has been in great part, unfortunately, destroyed by a second wave or third wave of suburbanization and Americanization of building types. The original gates of the neighborhood, which was probably one of the very first gated communities in Latin America, 1950. Some of the extraordinary integration of houses with the landscape, and integration also of modern architecture with the landscape. One of the project which I think is one of the most interesting in Latin America, a unbuilt project by Luis Barragan for a new town outside of Mexico City, of which the heart, the center, would be a sort of a grand boulevard, but built up as a series of platforms in the pre-Columbian manner. These extraordinary drawings and models that exist of that unbuilt project. So that was a bit on the sort of Mexican side. Now, very quickly in Argentina, for example, Buenos Aires, a city essentially of horizontal line, as it was very well described by Corbusier, Werner Hegemann, and many others, but very quickly in the 1920s and 1930s explodes vertically, first through some sort of codes that are related to the New York City Code of 1916, but later on to more modern code, and what you see to the left, to the right, in fact, are the sort of decomposition of the urban block driven by the new codes that followed after 1945 and eventually prevented not only the maintenance of the sort of courtyard structure of Buenos Aires, but also eventually started dislocating the traditional urban fabric. But again, I think Latin America is a place where we can be reminded that density of population, growth of population, hyper-centralization of cities is a major issue, and which actually shows us that building 3 or 4 story high neighborhoods and cities already didn't work in the 1940s. It was already too low density. You had to go further, and you had to imagine, and Buenos Aires is an extremely beautiful example of a city which is more or less 8-10 story high and functions quite well, even though it has its problems, but it also has some of the most beautiful skyscrapers in the history of the Americas, the Cavanac there from the 1930s. And I'll end with Rio de Janeiro and Brazil. Rio de Janeiro, it's not the law of the Indies, but it's a little grid as well. But even though it keeps a lot of the elements that were discussed on Thursday afternoon in the session led by Andrew Georgiadis, this extraordinary rendering of the city. But again, the influence of French transformation, the opening of great boulevards across the city fabric, the shift in density and in profile of streets. This street, Avenida Branco there, this is an image of 1905, so it goes from 1-2 story to about 6-7. The creation of extraordinary urban spaces, which are new parks built along miles of the Copacabana Bay. This is built in 1900. A beautiful photo that reminds us of what the profile of Rio was up to the 1930s, essentially a city of 1 or 2 story high buildings, most of it. This is Flamengo Gloria. If you were to look at exactly that same picture today, everything would be about 15-20 story high average. This is in 1934 with the Hindenburg Zeppelin. The arrival and the passage of Le Corbusier through Latin America. Le Corbusier who used Rio de Janeiro and other cities of Latin America to sort of change his understanding of what modern urbanism could be, less rigorously gridded and Beaux-Arts and more organic. He proposed these quite remarkable ideas of combining freeway with urban housing. And Le Corbusier also acknowledged the importance of the favelas. Very early on in the 1930s, he went to visit some of those projects. I'm going to go a little faster here. Some important projects also for urban campuses. Here by Lucio Costa in Rio de Janeiro, unfortunately unbuilt campus, which actually was entered through an incredibly important square that would have had a theater, a very tall administration tower, and a grand portico that you can see here, the top, and a great axis throughout the landscape, unfortunately unbuilt. Some very good urban housing project in Rio by Lucio Costa, showing that, in fact, buildings on pilotis can be perfectly well functioning in the city, extremely rational, and also very good in terms of tropical environment. And here are some of those spaces. And ending with Roberto Burle Marx and the tradition of parks in Latin America, Venezuela, Brazil, and many others. Prague understood as a reinterpretation graphically of modern painting and abstract painting. Abstract painting to draw the plans of the Prague, but eventually creating absolutely very humane and very friendly spaces. Perhaps one of the greatest projects in the history of urbanism in the 20th century anywhere is the great Aterro de Flamengo, which is a Prague 5 miles long, built along the Bay of Copacabana, adding to the Prague that had been started 60 years earlier, and that is also contains important public structures and which receive approximately 200,000 or 300,000 people every day that at the end of the day move down from the neighborhoods, go to the Prague and recede into the neighborhood systematically, so creating perhaps one of the greatest complex of public space. And here you can see at the time of inauguration leading toward the sugar loaf. And of course, it couldn't finish about Latin America without Brasilia. The sort of cross in the desert that you see here, the foundation axis of Brasilia, but also the sort of paradox of Indian life, savage life in a certain way, and technology in this quite extraordinary photograph. Brasilia that is not possible to think about without thinking about, for instance, Tenochtitlan or thinking about Teotihuacan and the sort of urban spaces of pre-Columbian America, which are urban spaces that are extremely large and then only gather people for very specific purposes. Also very important, and that's always a little bit provocative, is that Brasilia was actually built upon the system of neighborhoods. Contrary to what many people think, the model for the neighborhood of Brasilia was the famous diagram of Perry and Clarenstein that has been reinterpreted by Andres Duani and many other new urbanists. In fact, that diagram was fundamental in the development of Lucius Costa's vision for Brasilia, and you can see how it can be adapted eventually using 4 neighborhoods organized around a cross-axis of services. And, Brasilia is a very special place, but, even though it has very few of the traditional streets, it is also almost a gigantic garden, if you wish. It's a sort of a modern garden city. That's pretty much what Brasilia is in reality. And when you see it in this sort of contemporary image, it is a very, very different and a much more humane environment than the traditional images that we see, which are from the very beginning in the early 60s. And my last image is an image of hope, and this is to transition to Adib Kure, which is essentially informal urbanism, informal cities in Latin America, and this is called El Bosque de la Esperanza, the forest or the forest of hope, which is a project in a favela of Colombia, designed by Giancarlo Mazzanti for the Shakira Foundation to help poor people and poor neighborhoods to develop the infrastructure that they need. And that is, of course, the new frontier of Latin American urbanism, where perhaps they're the most interesting things built anywhere in the world in terms of relationship between the private and the public space. Thank you.
There you go. This was a rush.
Good afternoon. I would like to, fantastic presentation by Jean-Francois as always, and a challenge to follow after Jean-Francois, actually. Incredible images. But I would like to thank Professor Jaime Correa, first and foremost, for having invited me to participate, actually to attend and participate and show you in this conference and show you some of the works, research that we have been working on. So a few colleagues and myself at the School of Architecture at the University of Miami over the last few years, actually, and to share with you some of the story and some of the lessons that we've learned from studying informal cities. And it's a story that really begins, I should say, in 2004. On a very hot night in the summer of 2004, we traveled with a group of students to Mumbai, India. And we were confronted for the first time, really, with some of the things we had been reading about, and some of the things that we have been reading about from the World Bank, such as the fact that since World War II, global population has increased from 2 billion to 5.5 billion, incredible numbers, and that nearly all of this growth has taken place in the developing world, where the urban population has grown from 300 million to 3.2 billion today. And this, by the way, to put it in context, this is larger than the total world population when JFK was first inaugurated. Now, most of these urban dwellers, I should say, live in communities that, while composed of buildings that range from single shacks to permanent structures, belong to what we consider to be an urban geography that is literally off the map. And this is the title of the presentation. It is a condition which is undocumented, illegal, mobile, ephemeral, and generally beyond the reach of government services and infrastructure. They even lack, in fact, an agreed upon descriptive term. They are often or variously referred to as slums, informal settlements, shanty towns, or unplanned cities, and are often seen as nothing but undifferentiated pockets of misery racked by poverty, crime, and unsanitary conditions. This, in fact, in other words, is an unfortunate but inevitable waste product of the uncontrolled urban growth that characterizes our time. Now, we feel that this view is unfortunate and that it is, in fact, also often misguided. Now, while it is undeniably precarious in construction, these informal cities exhibit underlying, what we consider to be underlying urban and architectural patterns of remarkable resilience. And, in fact, they reflect, according to what we've seen, their inhabitants' enduring cultural values. They are often built without the assistance of architects and or planners, and they are, in many ways, folkloric expressions of a given people, which are, in fact, worthy of study. And this is what we've been doing to this date for the last 6 years, 7 years. Now, to date, the informal city, generally speaking, has largely been described in social, political, and economic terms. Very little scholarship has been devoted to the study of the cities as works of architecture, and questions of representation, most importantly, or how to map or how to document, record the site, seem to be missing from the debate. In fact, it's a kind of lacuna in this debate. And while it is undeniable that architecture represents just only one very small aspect of this complex reality, we believe, though, that, in fact, we're architects and urban designers, that it is the ultimate and verifiable expression of any given reality. Now, to this end, I will present the work, the research really of the University of Miami School of Architecture, which is entitled Off the Map, Learning from the Informal City. I'm going to show you just a very glimpse of this, which is research that has been done in Barranquilla, Colombia. It's a part of a studio, a kind of a laboratory that we did a few years ago, a year and a half ago, where we visited the town of Las Flores. Las Flores is an informal settlement in Barranquilla, Colombia. And we went there to learn, really, the idea was to go there and learn from its existing conditions and existing landscape and see really firsthand how it works, how this place works. We went there with this idea of, the idea was to look non-judgmentally at this environment by studying, mapping, and documenting its existing conditions. The initial discoveries and lessons really would inform later on the various design proposals that were eventually developed, and which ranged in many ways from architectural projects at a larger scale to very small kind of acupunctural projects within the city. Now, the studio's research, or the research in general, began with a comparative urban mapping of 11 informal cities in the southern hemisphere, which is where this really global problem is at its largest. And they included places such as Shaka in India, which we visited before. This is where we landed in 2004. Kayalisha in South Africa, Kibera in Kenya, Oranjetown in Pakistan, La Chacarita in Paraguay, La Perla in Puerto Rico, Villa 41 in Argentina, en Barlovento, Santa Cruz del Islote, and Las Flores in Colombia. The three last ones were in Colombia. By the way, Santa Cruz del Islote is an incredible, remarkable example. It's an island that is completely informal off the coast of Cartagena. It's not known very well. Now, most examples were located on flat parcels. This is something that we decided immediately to do because it allowed us to eliminated the problem of sections, which is very difficult to document. And they were also, we chose examples that were close, adjacent to the formal city. Their proximity to the formal city allowed us to have a direct and poignant comparison of the respective physical patterns. Now, the selected sites also range in overall area from 2.3 acres to nearly 13,000 acres, and they also range in population density. There were some smaller settlements, such as Barlovento, Chaca, and La Perla, and there were other, which were documented in their entirety, and there were other emblematic sectors of larger cities, such as Orangi Town and Cayalisa in South Africa, which were selected for issues of comparison. We were interested in documenting and comparing Latin American examples with examples in Africa, for example, to get a sense of scale and issues regarding culture. Now, the 11 examples were drawn at the same scale, a necessary graphic convention, which was for us very important, also important for any comparative analysis, and represented as figure ground drawings. So something that goes back, and I know everyone in this room knows about figure grounds, but this allowed us to document the totality of the city or sector at a fixed moment in time. Now, the figure ground plan, along, as we very well know, established architectural drawing convention, would allow us to distinguish between built form and space, rendering the former in black and the latter in white, and it was fundamental in analyzing the morphology of these cities. For our purposes, in our research, no graphic distinction was made between the formal and the informal city. Doing so, we felt, would unnecessarily prejudice the reading of the drawing. Now, I should say that recently scholars have claimed that the informal city is incomprehensible two-dimensionally and must be perceived as a city in motion, a three-dimensional construct of incremental development. And while it is undeniable that the informal city is kinetic and ever-changing as an urban condition, it is also true, though, we think, that once these settlements are established, their sites are fixed. We know this, actually. They are not relocated unless their inhabitants are forcibly displaced. And even when these individuals return, or they are displaced, they actually return time and time again to rebuild the city in a similar pattern to the original. Now, one such example of this it happens in the villas in Buenos Aires, and I won't talk about this in much more detail, but it actually is something that we've seen happens often in Latin America. Now, furthermore, while methods of construction are continuously evolving from less permanent to more permanent materials, the urban patterns, as you can see in these images, in the subdivisions of land is remarkably resilient. For this reason, the figure ground drawing is a useful and valuable tool in understanding the overall and, in many instances, permanent aspects of the informal. Now, the figure grounds that you've seen here were produced over a few weeks, and and in some cases they were drawings that were produced on site, and they revealed striking similarities as well as several notable differences. We found, for example, that generally the informal cities were compact with clearly delineated boundaries, either natural or man-made, and very few points of entry. Their physical patterns were organic and irregular, adapting and developing incrementally over time as the needs and circumstances of the community changed, and their built fabric was denser than that of the formal city, with an incredibly complex network of very small pedestrian scale streets and relatively few public open spaces. Oftentimes, we also found that there was no clear hierarchy between the public realm and the built fabric. And many buildings were mixed use with commercial and public functions occurring in small increments throughout the entire city. This last observation, by the way, was confirmed by on-site documentation both in Latin America and abroad. In India, it's the same case. Now, despite these similarities, the drawings also reveal differences that could be attributed to the local history, culture, and/or geographic circumstances of the given city. Typically, in the case of Latin America, examples were composed of party wall buildings grouped to create, as we can see in the example of, let's say, El Pozón in Cartagena, Colombia. They create small blocks that continuously define the edges of the street. This manner of developing cities has been systematically used by diverse cultures, and when it comes to Latin America by way of the Spanish colonization, we just heard Jean-François speaking about this very beautifully. Conversely, though, the African examples were a continuous patchwork of small detached structures that appear at first glance to have no recognizable order or hierarchy. However, upon closer inspection, we found that a more subtle pattern began to emerge. In fact, individual structures were actually loosely organized around communal courtyards, very much in keeping with the vernacular tribal settlements of the region. Generally speaking, the African examples were also far denser than Latin American examples, even the ones that we found in Colombia. However, the densest settlement by far, by a significant figure in fact, was the settlement of Shaka in Mumbai in India. Here the population density was over 1,100 persons per acre, nearly 3 times that of the Latin American examples. Now, the figure ground drawing served for us really as a point of departure for anything for analyzing these informal cities. However, to gain more ground, to understand them more in depth, and understand their complexities, we felt and we still believe that it's necessary to draw them and document them on site, in situ. We need to travel to these places, and so to this end, as a group, we traveled to the northern coast of Colombia, South America, to learn from Las Flores, this informal settlement that I'm going to be speaking to you about very briefly. This is an informal settlement that is located at the intersection, those of you who know Colombia, it's at the intersection of the Magdalena River, one of the most important rivers in Colombia, and the swamp of Mallorquín, which is to the left-hand side of the image. Swamp of Mallorquín, Magdalena River, this is Barranquilla. Las Flores is a little red dot on the upper left-hand side. And we traveled there, and in the specific study of Las Flores, by way of drawing, would allow us to analyze the structure of this informal city, and including its districts, blocks, streets, public and private buildings, the degree of specificity of the informal city, and allow us to get a more in-depth understanding of the place. This is an image of Las Flores in the foreground, and the city of Barranquilla in the far distance, and the Magdalena River in the middle, as a middle ground. The foundation of Las Flores lacks proper historical documentation. If I were to explain to you and give you a historical context of the place, there's anecdotal evidence, like in many towns in the coast of Barranquilla. This is a kind of Macondo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There's anecdotal evidence that suggests that the settlement was originally established by a small group of fishermen who were displaced by the armed conflict taking place throughout the Colombian countryside beginning in the 1940s. This violent economic and political turmoil eventually led to the massive displacement of people living in the hinterlands. And the first builders of Las Flores were the fishermen who arrived from nearby fishing hamlets in search of a better life. Now, they relocated to this flat, somewhat desolate, at least at that moment in time, and geographically isolated area, also at least more or less at that moment in time, commonly known as Bocas de Ceniza. Bocas de Ceniza is this very great, beautiful site, a site of great natural beauty, as you can see from this image, located at the mouth of the Magdalena River and adjacent to the swamp of Mallorquín that you saw in the image in the previous slide. Now, at this time, this vast fluvial landscape was populated by a variety of fish and wildlife, which overall provided the main sustenance to the early settlers. They became fishermen. And the first unpaved streets that were founded even lacked names, again, like Macondo, and they were mostly likely located closer to the now well-developed Via 40, along the southern edge of the settlement known as Barrio Nuevo. In time, though, these streets in this town, in these original wattle and dub houses, gave way to more permanent wood structures that slowly began to reclaim the edges of the swamp. Today, this is 60 years ago, today, 60 years later, Las Flores is a slowly growing, picturesque and dusty settlement of approximately 10,000 inhabitants. It's an improbable settlement, really, that encompasses 0.5 square miles. It's bounded on the eastern edge by the Magdalena River, on the southernmost edge by the Via 40, this main road that you see here, Via 40, and on the northern edge by the swamp of Mallorquín. Most of the urban fabric, as you can see, you'll see in more detail in the next few images, is composed at this moment in time of concrete and clay block dwellings, very typical of Latin American informal cities, sparsely surrounded by dusty almond trees, a kind of local species in Barranquilla, and tightly assembled to protect itself from the intemperate sun. It's very hot, very warm in that place of Colombia. The many public improvements, most notably access to running water and electricity, as well as canalization to prevent from flooding, which is very often the case that happens all over Barranquilla. These have been the result of a very interesting relationship between the public and private initiatives, generally funded by the generosity of private local businesses, some of which are located immediately adjacent to the informal city. This is Las Flores. This is Via 40. This is a large company that produces glass and aluminum. And there's another large company that produces Argos, that produces concrete. Now, a map of Las Flores, if you were to look at this map, it does not immediately reveal a spatial system composed of distinct districts. Yet, when you go there and you start walking the city with the local leaders, the leaders began to, they began their descriptions of the place of Las Flores by actually pointing at the neighborhoods or pointing to the neighborhoods of the settlement. They say, for example, over a map, they trace the name of the districts, and they begin to name them rather carefully, very precisely, in fact. They name the Barrio Nuevo, they name Barrio Amarillo, Nueva Esperanza, Cajuan, Barrio Tambo, La Cuchi, Chipi Chipi, which is a very interesting name, it's a local name. And they know it. They clearly understand the town in that manner. Now, the oldest sector, ironically called the Barrio Nuevo, or New Neighborhood, is a triangular parcel of land bordered by the Via 40 to the south of the industrial lands, to the south of the city. It contains the only two-story residential structures and the most important public buildings of the community. Currently, the Barrio Nuevo appears isolated, rather cut off from the rest of the urban fabric by the enlarged Via 40. Yet, at the time of its founding, the geography of the area was quite different. The edges of the swamp of Mallorquín were actually located alongside the present-day road, providing the fishermen direct access to the Caribbean Sea. So at the beginning, the swamp actually came more or less up to here. And this Barrio Nuevo was actually right in front of the swamp, which allowed the fishermen to go right up to it. Las Flores has grown, as I mentioned, incrementally through progressive landfills that have extended the informal city into the swamp, and the successive districts are connected to this evolution. The physical boundary between districts is not immediately discernible to the visitor, yet as one lingers, carefully mapping the city's form, more subtle morphological characteristics are revealed. The physical landscape echoes the social fabric of the city. The older districts, for the most part, are denser. They have more permanent buildings built largely of concrete and clay bricks, more landscape, which is very important, clearly defined public spaces and access to public services. The more established and wealthier settlers live in these areas. In fact, the people who take you around, the community leaders, are from these areas, from Barrio Nuevo, for example. The newer districts are far more precarious in construction, lack public spaces and access to running water, and this is where the poorest residents live, which is essentially this area located next to the swamp, the new arrivals. Now, the city, as we know, can largely be characterized by its individual dwelling. The development of the insula in Rome, the casa patio in Latin America, the Viennese housing block, and the detached house in the American city are but a few examples that reveal the intimate connection between the form of the dwelling and the form of the city. However, or moreover, the dwelling materially presents, we think, a people's way of life and can be viewed as a precise manifestation of a given culture. Its salient characteristics develop slowly over time and are not only a response to the local geography, but also the constructive social and economic realities of the place. The first act of building, in the case of Las Flores, which is, again, very typical we found throughout most of these informal cities in Latin America, is to lay claim to an empty parcel of land, which is an empty, like the one you see on the image on the wall. This is done really by staking two large wooden posts, approximately 4 to 4.5 meters apart, about 12, 13 feet. These posts are tied together with a taut rope that demarcates the future front elevation of the new dwelling. The overall width of the lot is remarkably consistent from place to place, from lot to lot, and is determined by tectonics. It's really specifically the maximum allowable span of a conventional wood rafter, and something that allows for two people to be able to lift it rather quickly and assemble rather quickly, in some cases overnight. The dwelling begins with the construction of a single room, then measuring 4 by 4 meters, and a covered front porch. This is the first act of building the house. The space, this 4 by 4 room, 13 by 13 feet, is used for living, cooking, and sleeping. And the porch serves as an intermediate space between the single-room dwelling and the street. The original structure is built in wood, as you see in the second image on the right-hand side. The cheapest and most readily available material in the area, in most cases recycled wood. In time, though, the wood house is replaced by a masonry shell, as you see on the image on the bottom right, built of hollow clay or block walls and concrete structural frame. Replacing the original wooden structure with a masonry one, as you see, is a willful aesthetic act. It's actually, they believe that wood, of course, is fragile, it weathers quickly, and is considered by the locals, in most cases, to be a poor man's material. And so masonry, on the other hand, is the prevalent building material of the former historical city of Barranquilla. Barranquilla, if you drive around, is a kind of Corbusian city. It's mostly concrete. So it is more permanent and associated with greater stability, both structure and economically. The new masonry houses built in Las Flores directly resemble those of the Barrio Bajo, which is a formal neighborhood next door. next to it. And this mimetic act carries with it the hope of a building a better environment and with it a better way of life. The construction of the dwelling in the informal city is, as we see, is never a singular act. The house then grows slowly over time, incrementally. It expands incrementally towards the rear of the property. This little sketch on the left-hand side was done on site. They begin to add rooms measuring about 2 by 3 meters connected by a narrow corridor. Then the oldest houses, those that you may find in the areas of Barrio Nuevo, they have access to running water and contain a small bathroom, which is typically adjacent to the living room. This type, if you were to see it, glance at it very, very quickly, would resemble an African shotgun house in plan, but the similarities actually end right there. In fact, unlike the shotgun house typology, the Las Flores dwelling is a party wall condition, one next to the other. And while the former, the shotgun house yields interiors which have, as you well know, abundant light and cross ventilation, the latter, the one in Las Flores, which is typical of Barranquilla and these informal cities in Barranquilla, is very dark with little air circulation. And as a result, the inhabitants spend most of their time outdoors on the porch, where they are protected from the intense heat of the exterior. Now, in the shade, as you know, they can enjoy the prevalent breezes that sweep through the city from the Caribbean Sea. These porches, as you can see, this image shows very low porches, but I'll show you some in the next few images, begin to abut one another to create a very interesting continuous urban facade. And the small repetitive housing units provide a fine grain to the city, creating a dynamic urbanism that promotes social interaction. Now, Las Flores is composed of approximately 75 very thin quasi-rectangular blocks ranging from 100 to 300 feet or 200 to 500 feet. Originally, the blocks were laid out with the longest sides or edges fronting the swamp of Mallorquín, as you see here. But recently, the direction of the block was shifted to run parallel to the edges of the river, the Rio Magdalena. The more typical orientation for towns which are founded along the Rio Magdalena is actually that way. So it's a very interesting way of, again, mimicking what was already existing at the urban scale. This is actually an image of Las Flores, one of the main streets, at least from the center plaza, the Plaza de los Pescadores, which shows you this very repetitive condition of porches, one after the other. Now, the public space, there's a striking lack of public space, open space in Las Flores, which was a discovery, a lesson that we found. The most important spaces, the soccer field, are in the Plaza de los Pescadores, or Fisherman's Plaza, are located near the geographic center of the settlement in close proximity to one another. The former is a large dirt field, and the latter is a small triangular plaza, as you see in the image, defined by one-story masonry buildings on all sides. This is an image of the Plaza de los Pescadores, which is a triangular plaza sketched by one of the students that was there. And then these are all the public spaces that are within the city. An image of actually the photograph of the plaza itself, as you can see, is heavily landscaped. And this is actually the plaza now from within, and then the housing stock that actually defines the edges of the plaza, painted very colorfully and very beautifully in some cases. And this is an example of part of the research that compares the urban spaces across the globe in these informal cities. This is in Shaka, in Mumbai, this is in Paraguay, and this is the one in Las Flores, where the soccer field is really a kind of empty space. But what is important about this, what we found, is that even though they lack housing, and the housing is very important for them, they consider this common space to be very sacred and to be kept as is and not to be invaded or squatted. And they also have very well-placed public buildings. Not many of them, but they work on the placement of the buildings in a very interesting way. And one of the most important buildings, public buildings, is actually the Catholic Church, which is at the intersection of the Old Town and La Vía 40, and the school, which is actually closer to the center of the neighborhood. And this is a drawing that actually explains to you where most of these public buildings are, as well as the commercial buildings. There's an incredible amount of live-work units. It's the live-work unit city par excellence. Almost every single house has one. And then we discover one of the great lessons for us as well is that while they do have problems with the housing, with the houses themselves. As I mentioned to you, they lack light, they lack ventilation, and so on. We felt, and we were told, in fact, that this is not necessarily the problem. The problem that they have, or the concern, or the role, the way they think architects and urban designers could help them is in the design of public spaces and public buildings, which is why the work of Giancarlo Massanti and others in Colombia has had such a great and profound impact on the city. And so when we came back to Miami after doing all this research, some of the students, the work that the students produced was actually not in the house, not necessarily designing houses, but designing public and projects in civic spaces. And one of the ones that was most interesting is this one by Mike O'Neill, who's now going to graduate school, just recently graduated, who proposed a great ecological project really at the scale of the country, really, because it's actually the recovery of the swamp that would allow for the city to restore its mangrove and to bring back the fish, and designing a building that would actually over time be taken out. And once the mangrove was rebuilt or recovered, it's actually a building for the nursing of fish. And these are views of it. And then one other project that I'll show you, I'll stop here because I know I'm over time and Jaime's about to take me away. It's actually it's a project for a meeting hall for the pescadores, the fishermen, and the children. There are many children around. There are about 100 children that need a place to, at least, a place to eat on a daily basis. And so this project was done as a response to that challenge that they gave us to design a building for that purpose. And there was a building that was influenced by the local vernacular, and the building ultimately was designed in this manner, incorporating a lot of materials and materiality of the city, as well as the kind of vernacular aesthetic that is prevalent not only in Barranquilla, but throughout the area of the Magdalena River, and also in the manner of these great folkloric paintings that are very famous in that area of town. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Jaime to invite me to speak with this amazing set of thinkers, and thank you again for your resilience for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit of space syntax. As you know, these were ideas that were developed in Europe, and some of the issues in trying to apply it to the Latin American city. First, I'd like to ask who knows anything about space syntax or has heard about it? Okay, some of you. Right. Well, I always start with this image, who or what is what shapes our cities. And we obviously find forces that are top-down, no? Like transport planners, urban planners, government authorities, and then we have the forces that go from the bottom up, no? Like society, the social process that determines some of the locations of land use, and also market forces, of course. And space syntax starts from the idea of thinking that maybe we're focusing too much on the top-down forces and not paying enough attention to the bottom-up processes. So they say the key idea is to understand human activity, and once we understand this, we're going to sort of decode the DNA of cities, and then we're going to be able to plan according to those forces. This is an image of the station of Victoria in London, and this is actually traces of how people move actually in space. Like literally we sent observers to track down how people were moving and where people were stopping to do several activities. And this is the sort of studies that are behind the space syntax kind of study. So we know, intuitively we know that human activity happens in space, right? We have the public space network, which on the one hand is the space of movement, is where all the flows, whether pedestrian, vehicular, etc. happen. But then on the other hand, public space should also be the space for socialization, the social space. Or, well, I put this to say, well, it should be. It doesn't necessarily is, because we know car has colonized a lot of space and has suppressed this social space, especially in Latin American cities now. They're following a lot the model-based model. So we intuitively know there's a link between space and the things that happen in space, no? Human activity. But what the people that do space syntax says is the key idea is to find what's this link, right? So Bill Hillier always starts with images like this, and he says, if this was an imaginary grid, piece of a city, where's my pointer? It's gone. Well, anyway, if there was a piece of a city, it's not really. It's just any grid. And we had activities distributed along there. There's somewhere in the grid where you live, and then somewhere else where you go visit friends. And, oh, he not only takes more time, but he takes the pointer. Oh, wait. So if this was a piece of city, you know, where there was somewhere where you lived, and there's somewhere else where you shopped, anywhere, and then somewhere else where you go visited friends, and then visited your mom, and so on and so on. All the activities that we all have to do, we would need to move in this grid, right? And right now it's just a grid, and we're not putting any land uses or land values or anything else on it. But just naturally, as a property of the network itself, we would expect that most of the movement would happen, say, along this line, right? And we just know this intuitively. Why? Because this is the if it was a street, it would be the street with the most hierarchy and with the most number of connections. So Bill says, he comes up with this concept of natural movement. He says, is the amount of movement that we can just count on from the grid and its properties and its connections. Right. So the space syntaxers say, then we can maybe think that the link between this space and the way we use space or human activity is a layout of space, and they call it configuration, no? The way the parts of cities are put together. And then they say in the speech, well, this in reality will make for more walkable, livable, vibrant, competitive, sustainable, etc., cities, which is really the part that is interesting, no? As planners or urban designers or architects is what we're looking for. So, how do we measure this ability of the grid to attract movement? And they come up with this abstract representation of the city called the axial map. The axial map is basically the least long lines that can cross all the system of public space in a city or a neighborhood or whatever we're studying. So it would look something like that. And then we would think of every line as if it was a node. And then we would make the connections between all nodes. So say if we have this long street here, it would connect with all these different streets. So we would map these as connections, and it would give us something like that, where each of these dots is one of those lines, and then it's linked or is connected with every other street that crosses it. Okay, I hope I'm not getting too technical by this. By the end of the conference, and you're all just disconnecting from what I'm saying. Okay, so then he comes to his second most important idea of space syntax, which is movement economies. He says, okay, if we have the ability to sort of map the potential that the grid has to attract movement, so then you see that we end up with this axial map. And it's colored from here, warmest to coldest colors, where the red or the warmest colors mean it's more accessible or it attracts more potential of movement. And the dark blue here is the one that is more segregated, or the one that has the least ability to attract movement. Then we would end up with something like this, right? Where we have a few very well connected, very long lines that look warmer, and would be the ones that, taking into consideration just the morphology, just the configuration of the street layout, would be able to attract more movement. And then, on the other hand, we can again send some people to the streets and actually measure the amount of people that literally walk on the streets, no? Pedestrian flow. Then we could use this to calibrate our model. And it's found that generally it coincides a lot. No? We don't need to do much more calibration than just measuring it. So we find that, say, on these lines that are the most accessible, or in space syntax terms, the most integrated, we also find high flows of movement. Here we're using the same language. No? Highest movement rates are red, and the lowest ones are blue. And then we find these sort of more labyrinthine, more segregated areas where pedestrian rates are lower. And then we can also express this mathematically and find that there's some correlation on it. And so far, it's all very happy. So then Hiller and his colleagues say, okay, then if we can say that the urban fabric can somehow influence accessibility through its configuration, we know that we find in a city or a neighborhood, we have areas with high rates of movement and areas with low rates of movement. In the areas with high rates of movement, normally we will find that uses such as retail and so on locate there. This form what he calls the life centers. And then in the areas with low rates of movement, there's activities such as residential, and this is what we call, or what we know as a city. So like I said, this is all very happy here. This is an area in London where we have accessibility map. The black dots are shops, and it all correlates very nicely. And then we have examples. For example, this is a famous project they did with Norman Foster in Trafalgar Square, which was a very dead square. They did the whole study, went over there to measure what people did, model it, that sort of propose something, opening up a stair here, use it to predict, and then see what happened. This was the artist's impression, what they wanted to achieve, and this is what actually happened. So it's still very happy from here. Let's focus on the bottom-up processes. So, like I said, it was all very happy through here. However, I came up with my crazy idea of measuring this same phenomena in Latin American cities, right? As we know, it has been very nicely explained, they are geometric grids. So I come up with something like that, where again the black dots are a retail. So it's all not so happy, right? But then, again, intuitively, and as an inhabitant of Mexico City, I know there are places that feel like places. So there must be something underlying there, guiding these sort of processes. So we took a little bit of Mexico City. This is the urban sprawl, and this is the first ring, which was just a small portion, but already like 160,000 plots to study there and to look at their land uses. Some places looking something like that. And again, we did our axial map, and then we said, no, wait a second. But if we cannot see a pattern visually, we probably need a scale where we look at it in more detail. So what we did is we connected the axial lines to the plots there, and then we make them nodes. And then we ended up with something like that, a little bit more complicated. That was our first methodological problem. And then the second thing is that obviously the relation here was not so obvious as in organic cities. So we, instead of just using a normal correlation, we decided to use a cumulative frequency, whereas some of you know if there was a pattern, we would be able to see it here, and if it was random, we would see no pattern there. So it all carried on being happy, and we came up with maps like this, which sort of made sense. This is a more local accessibility. The city center is right here. So yes, it looks sort of warm, and then we had some other centralities happening there at different scales. And then that is the global one, and it sort of made sense. This is the historical center. But the most interesting bit is that we did find some patterns. And red here is residential, and this is the amount of accessibility. So as accessibility increased, we saw that the occurrence of residential uses went down, and then other uses such as small commercial, big commercial, and offices increased. So that meant we did find some movement economy happening there. So we said, okay, maybe we do find what Bill says, and I went to Bill and said, well, look, you were right, Bill. All this mess just to tell him, you were right. In organic cities, there's the movement economy process, both in the land use distribution and the morphology of the cities. They're both bottom-up processes. However, in regular cities, we of course have these bottom-up forces happening in the land use distribution, but the form of the city has been largely influenced by political decisions, and going back like it was explained, the grid and the loss of indies, etc., giving it this form. But then we went on thinking, well, but still there's also places like that. So what happens? How do we use this? How do we apply it to do the more walkable, livable, sustainable, etc., factor? So we went on a second part to see, well, maybe we could explore some of these centers that we have found, or some of this life center component, and on the one hand look at their morphology, their spatial and geometric characteristics, through the configuration and layout, then maybe look at the amount of provision of services that is available to the people of the catchment areas of these places, and then maybe look and see if there's a relation with socioeconomic groups. Maybe you look at income levels and see if we can find patterns of any sort. And so that's the top ranks of our accessibility plots that you saw before. So from there we took these centers, then we drew some catchment areas, just normal buffers, and we started looking at all of these elements. First of all, what we could see at first glance, before looking at it more statistically and getting more sophisticated, was that basically the fact that most of the centers were located on the southwest side was already telling us something, no? That there's already a pattern maybe of social spatial segregation, and what we find in the literature is maybe true. And this also sort of correlated with some of the things that we saw in the axial map. So just looking at it like that, we could see that most of the blue is concentrated on the east side and not on the west side. And well, this comes with further things, that this side has most of the externalities, former industrial areas are there, the lake Texcoco is there that is now dry out, and it blows a lot of dust storms. They have the airport here, which comes with a lot of noise, etc., etc. And that's a subject for another topic. But we sort of start finding that there was some relation between these patterns. And then, of course, we looked at the spatial component. This is how the centers were sort of embedded in their context, whether they were more or less embedded at a global and local scale. We drew, like we said, some catchment areas over the fabric, because, of course, we're not birds, we don't fly, we walk on the fabric. And then we look, like we said, at provision of different things: retail, office space, health, education, leisure, open space. We looked at these 3 different scales: 5-minute walking, 5-minute cycling, and 5-minute by car. And then we compared all these with the income levels, like we said. Over here is the income levels that come in on the census. Red is the highest one that comes on the census, and the blue, dark and light blue, and are the poorest one, let's say, between less than 1 or 2 minimum wage. And again, we see this pattern, no? As we move southwest, let's say we find more occurrence of the rich here, and although we don't find very severe patterns of poverty, of course, this is just the first ring, we're not looking at the periphery here, but we do find that this red tends to increase towards this side, and the blue tends to increase towards that side. So this just kept confirming our hypothesis. Finally, then, we looked at a summary of all these patterns that we were trying to find. And we did find, well, some spatial types on how they were embedded. Some of them were more global, some of them were more local. But we didn't really find any relation, say between the socioeconomic group, level of provision, and these spatial characteristics. However, we did find that the centers that were best provided all corresponded to long access on main high hierarchy roads, also the longest ones from the ones that we had, whereas the ones that were least provided basically were the ones that did not comply with this description. Either this one, which was the only one in a crossing, this which was the only one on the east-west axis, a main road, but not as high hierarchy as some of these. This is one of the main roads. It crosses the whole city. And this one running north-south, however not embedded on a longer north-south axis. So, as a conclusion, I'm about to finish, is, we did find a relation between morphology or spatial configuration, also subtle, And again, this confirming another thing that we had observed before, that there's higher accessibility north-south than east-west also. And yes, we found two different types. Let's say we could group them in two types from these, the things that we saw here. Like we said, some characteristics of morphology, although they were subtle. And this was related with which ones were best and least provided. And some of them we found work more globally, and some of them work more locally, because this had a higher amount of housing at the smaller scale, this had a higher amount of housing at the larger scale. But mostly, we found that this pattern is reinforced by the planning documents, no? This coincides with what the planning documents here regards just as housing. You can just build housing there. Of course, this doesn't happen because we find this bottom-up land use phenomena happening, and you always find the little corner store opens and then the little workshop. But, well, this is what's on paper. And these ones always coincide with sort of more mixed-use corridors. And, well, what to do from here would be now how to rebalance this into the planning documents, and sort of how to work against this lack of equity of provision. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.